Hello and a very warm welcome to this edition of the Ponsonby and Massie podcast. Coming up, a U-turn, or at least a partial U-turn, on winter fuel payments from the Prime Minister yesterday. Where is all of this going? Might it help save Labour's bacon in the forthcoming Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse by-election? Polling in that constituency 2 weeks today. Angela Rayner, is she on manoeuvres? A leaked paper to the Daily Telegraph outlining a whole series of tax proposals which in part would allow them to pay for the restoration of the winter fuel payment. Big news on the EU front this week with a reset deal. Is this the beginning of closer ties with the EU? And literally hot off the presses in the last couple of minutes, the net migration figures for 2024. I bet you Rishi Sunak is now feeling sick. Why is he feeling sick? Stay tuned and we'll tell you. But first of all, to winter fuel payments, which we're going to link with a story in Alex's newspaper today, The Times, which is saying that the Labour candidate in the by-election, Davy Russell, is dodging scrutiny in television debates. First of all, Alex, take us through the story that's in the paper this morning.
Yes, the Times reports that STV are wanting to get all the candidates for the Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse by-election together for what they grandiosely call a debate, but which they really hope will turn into a rammy or a fiasco for as many candidates as possible. And Labour, the Labour candidate, Davy Russell and Zoyner, appear to be have what we should say, cold feet about this proposal, seeing very limited upside for the Labour Party and their candidate in appearing in such a programme, and therefore doing their best to dodge it, which leads to one of these sort of traditional by-election things and so on, isn't it? That such and such a candidate is terrified of exposure, is terrified of being exposed by the media. And so, but Bernard, you've covered an awful lot of parliamentary by-elections over the years. This sort of shenanigans is not unusual, is it?
No, and the story which is in the paper is about a Labour candidate allegedly dodging scrutiny. I think that the article says that the Labour candidate is saying he would rather be chapping doors than taking part in debates. Well, given that this debate goes out at 10:30 at night, I hope he's not chapping doors at 10:30 at night in the by-election, because I would suggest that would do him no good whatsoever. Look, what tends to happen sometimes is that in parliamentary by-elections, and in this particular one, the story's about the Labour candidate, but it could be another by-election and it's another party. The scrutiny that comes in parliamentary by-elections is completely different from a general election situation. I mean, most candidates go through a general election situation, whether it's for Westminster or Holyrood, without any scrutiny. The most they may well have is to do a local public meeting with the community council and a local interview with the paper, the local newspaper. So the scrutiny is much higher, and sometimes the select candidates, how can I put it, who are not silver-tongued smoothies,
not ready for prime time,
who are not good for prime time. Now, there's a more fundamental question for all of the parties. Why would you select a candidate? Why would you select a candidate who is not up to the increased scrutiny? Now, in the by-election, which I fought away back in the 10th of November 1988, the Labour Party put up a candidate who was judged by journalists not to be a silver-tongued smoothie. But he turned up for a 1.5-hour debate at STV. He turned up for a 1-hour debate on the BBC. And of course, many people thought that his performances in these programmes, that there was a direct link between that and Labour losing the seat. So there is a culture in by-elections. If you don't have a lot of confidence in your candidate, hide them. Question for all of the parties: why do you put up candidates if you don't have full confidence in them?
Well, of course, but from the Labour Party's point of view and so on, I think they're absolutely right to think, well, what's in it for us? As you say, a programme going out at 10:30 at night. How many people in the constituency are actually likely to be watching it? It's a very small number. The whole point of the exercise from the media's perspective is to catch out or embarrass one or more of the candidates, and the more that happens, the better from the media's point of view.
What a
So
take.
it's not really about an exploration of the great issues of the day. Let's be honest about it. It's can we make these people look like clowns? So from the and obviously the media environment is so completely different now compared to the 1980s, 1990s, where you only had 4 TV channels, no internet, and so on. It is much easier for parties to reach voters in different ways now compared to that kind of broadcast environment back in the day. And so there is much less in it for them. And that does mean that there is probably in certain respects less scrutiny at by-elections and indeed at other elections too of individual candidates. But that's just the nature of the beast these days.
Yeah, and of course, one of the things which Labour will be pondering is whether or not the Prime Minister's comments in the House of Commons yesterday on winter fuel payments, whether or not that may well stop the rot. Now, what's absolutely clear on this story is that the parliamentary party are in a state of almost revolt following the English local elections, where Starmer has been told that there was literally not a door that you didn't knock on, where this was coming up as an issue. Now, here again, and this gets back to comments which I made on the last podcast and are a little bit of a theme, which is the incompetent way in which the Prime Minister seems to manage issues. So what did we get yesterday? We're going to help people with winter fuel payments when it is economically prudent to do so, and the economy is improving. Oh, get lost. Come off it. Come off it. There is no material change in economic circumstances. And in fact, given what he said yesterday, the logic of his position on this is that if there's a deterioration in the final quarter,
then we
in
should
the
cut it.
performance of the economy, there will be no movement. There will be no U-turn. So the way in which this argument again was framed yesterday was completely and utterly incompetent. Having announced that there will be a U-turn of sorts, and stay tuned for learning and what sorts actually means, the way in which he should have framed this was quite simple. He shouldn't have done it at Prime Minister's questions. He should have said, it is a strength of a political leader to listen. My party activists have been on the doorstep and they have conveyed to me in unambiguous terms what people think. I'm listening, and I can tell you that they will be restored in full when the Chancellor comes to the budget later in the year. Because I'll tell you what, if the logic of his announcement yesterday is that they're restored in part and not in full, then the backlash will be even bigger than the one that accompanied the scrapping in the first place. Having U-turned, you have to do the U-turn. You can't do a U-turn and then U-turn again.
Well, indeed. It seems quite clear that they're not planning at present, anyway, to do a complete U-turn. I don't know what is half a U, but that is essentially where we're going to be. That there'll be essentially winter fuel will be means tested. Now, from a policy point of view, it seems to me that if you are going to have winter fuel payments of this sort, then of course they should be means tested. It is ludicrous to be giving them out to people who have no financial requirement for that kind of assistance. But obviously, the politics of it are rather different from the policy. The politics, I think you're absolutely right. You will have an awful lot of angry pensioners crying that it's not fair that I don't get a benefit I don't need. And such is the temper of the times and so on, that will prove to be quite a successful and winning argument as far as the pensioners are concerned. I think it does. The whole fiasco, and it is a fiasco, because as you rightly said, at the English local elections, you had Labour candidates up and down the length and breadth of England and so on, reporting that winter fuel was the single thing the government had done that had cut through with voters more than anything else, and it has sort of helped persuade an awful lot of voters to think that this is a new age of austerity, which is remarkable given that Rachel Reeves in her budget increased taxes by £40 billion and increased spending by £70 billion. governments. The Labour Party's inability to tell the story of what it has actually been doing in government is quite breathtaking. And instead, we have this political hoo-ha over a relatively small benefit, much of which goes to people who have no need of it, as I say. And yet that has become, if you like, the sort of totemic issue. And so you're right, I think, Bernard, that the handling of this has been deplorable from start to finish. But in the government's defence, now maybe this is playing devil's advocate just a little bit and so on, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. Let me put it to you that it is 4 years until the next general election. And if we look back at history, and now history doesn't always repeat itself, of course, but we can see time and time again governments being extremely unpopular relatively early in a parliament, and yet going on to win re-election nonetheless. That things which seemed like enormous scandals or troubles or storms or whatever early on are forgotten about by the time you get to polling day. So I remember, going back even as recently as, say, Tony Blair and so on, the fuel protests, excitable newspapers were saying this is going to destroy Tony Blair's reputation. It might bring down the government, and so on and so on. You go back to Margaret Thatcher, extremely unpopular in the first 2 or 3 years of her term in office, unpopular again in 1984, 1985, in the start of her second term, and yet, goes on to win a third term nonetheless. So let me say to this, Bernard, it seems to be quite plausible, not certain, but quite plausible that come polling day in 2028, 2029, and so on, all of this will be forgotten.
Possibly, yeah, and I don't dissent from that as a general point. And of course, you're quite right. Before the 2001 election, it was right at the tail end of Labour's first term that they got into a bit of difficulty. And of course, perhaps an even starker issue to underline the general point that you're making, Blair won a third term in 2005 on the back of a deeply unpopular policy on Iraq. And although he lost a lot of seats in 2005, he still had a very comfortable parliamentary majority. I think it was around 66. Extremely comfortable indeed. So you're right on the general point that something can become a conductor rod for dissent, which fuels the unpopularity of the government, which, when it comes to a general election situation, can be managed, or indeed the political downside or the electoral downside has passed. That being said, I do think that, again, the way in which he frames, and you've just made the point about the tax and spend proposals, 40 billion higher taxes, 70 billion in spending, a lot of that going to the National Health Service, a lot of it going to people on the minimum wage, good bits of expenditure which they have not managed. They've got no credit for this whatsoever because they keep making a mess of other issues. And the 1.5 billion to fully restore winter fuel payments is loose change in public expenditure terms, which is why if he goes for some sort of limited restoration of winter fuel payments, he will get backlash number 2. So it is the inability to manage issues which is in part the problem. And of course, where could they find the money? Well, we learn this week that Angela Rayner sent some thoughts to Rachel Reeves about what they could do in terms of raising money, restoration of the lifetime allowance. She also suggested carbon migrant benefits. She suggested doing away with the allowance tax on dividends. She wanted higher corporation tax for the banks, and it was estimated that these proposals taken together could save £4 billion. Well, it's £1.5 billion for the winter fuel payments. And of course, what is really exercising a lot of Labour MPs is the proposed cuts to welfare, where it looks as if the government will try and save anywhere between 3.5 to 5 billion. Well, Rayner's proposals amount to 4 billion. And despite the fact right-wing newspapers are reporting all of this stuff as amounting to the red meat of socialism and all the rest of it, and denouncing it as Corbynism, A lot of this stuff, is extremely modest. It is extremely modest. It's frankly pretty moderate Labour stuff. But what it does do, of course, is that it points to an increasing fault line within the Parliamentary Labour Party between people who believe that effectively the Chancellor is too much of a slave to Treasury orthodoxy and not enough of a slave to Labour values.
Well, yes. I mean, Angela Rayner is, has the advantage. I mean, I think Angela Rayner will be quite happy that this has somehow or other found its way to the political desk of the Daily Telegraph. That is all upside for her because it cements her reputation amongst Labour's activist base, and that she is someone who is in touch with the party to a degree that Keir Starmer perhaps is not. I mean, you have often made the point on the podcast, Bernard, and absolutely correctly in my view, that Starmer is a very unusual leader of the party in as much as he lacks the kind of ideological anchors, as you put it, within the Labour movement and its history and its traditions and so on. And Angela Rayner has a story to tell. She is very much of the Labour Party, a creature of the party in a way that Keir Starmer isn't. And I suppose one of the differences, and again, just to go back to what I was talking about earlier, that other prime ministers have got into terrible trouble at various points in their tenure. But, with Tony Blair or Margaret Thatcher, you always understood what they were about, what they were attempting to achieve. You might not agree with them. You might hate what they were trying to achieve, but you had little doubt about what it was. And you can't say anything of the same sort, really, about Keir Starmer. It's much harder to say what it is that he believes in, what he really wants to achieve. And so, I think it is obviously far too soon to be talking about who will lead the Labour Party in a post-Starmer environment. But let me put it this way, that if there were to be a vacancy right now, then Angela Rayner would be a clear contender to take over. Wes Streeting, I think, would very much like to take over, but I do not believe that the Labour Party's grassroots and the Labour Party membership would actually back someone like Streeting and so on, who is openly ambitious, is also prepared to slaughter an awful lot of sacred cows within the NHS if that is what he deems necessary. I think that the Labour Party, which is quite a small C conservative movement at a grassroots level, I think, is not really up for that, doesn't really believe in it. And is much more of a sort of soft left type or base, I think, than and so somebody like Rayner would be in a good position for that. But the problem, the fundamental problem, and so on, is that when you look at the public finances and so on, we are spending more than £100 billion this year on debt interest payments. That is why there is relatively little room for manoeuvre for the Chancellor. And tinkering around with taxes, most of which would fall on the wealthy. Yes, you can do that, but the wealthy are actually taxed quite highly in the UK. It's actually the case that people on average incomes are taxed much more. Much less than they used to be, and people on middle to upper middle incomes are actually taxed quite highly. And that is a problem because the balance of taxation is no longer what it once was.
Yeah. I mean, getting back to the sort of political issue for the Prime Minister, I think the way to put this is that, and I think we're now at the stage of perhaps as many as 100, maybe even higher, of Labour MPs that don't want to support the welfare proposals. There is a lot of unease about the way in which the Prime Minister doesn't seem to be able to prosecute the good points from the government, never mind the bad points. There is a despair about the way in which political issues are managed. And I think the way to put this is that there is despair about the messaging, which hasn't yet got fully to despair about the messenger, but it could become despair about the messenger if his inability to sell what the government is doing does not improve. And indeed, when you look at the Rayner tax proposal, I mean, the lifetime allowance, she'd suggested that it would be restored to 1,073,000, which was what it was when the Tories abolished it. Now, the lifetime allowance was used by both Labour and Conservative chancellors. I mean, the Tories deplored it at one point, but actually kept it. I mean, just to explain to people, the lifetime allowance is a sum of money which, when your pension pot, and this tends to be pension pots in defined benefit pension schemes, gets beyond 1,073,000, you are liable to a higher rate of tax. One of the specific issues was that NHS consultants would have pension pots which exceeded this. So some consultants were retiring early in order that they didn't breach the lifetime allowance, in order that they weren't paying higher taxes in retirement. That I merely make the point. There are very few people in this country whose pension pots are greater than £1,073,000. And if you're happy enough to be in that position, surely you can pay a little more. This measure would have raised almost £1 billion. So you've almost got your money for your winter fuel payments. I mean,
But Bernie,
a tax on dividends. Let me just go. The tax on dividends. If you are in the fortunate position to be able to buy shares, to be able to own shares, to be able to make a profit from shares, then removing an allowance which amounts to £500 isn't going to be the end of the world. Slightly higher corporation tax for banks. You know, the sky is not going to fall down. These Angela Rayner proposals are not the stuff of the red meat of socialism. They're the kind of stuff that any Labour Chancellor worth their salt should be considering.
well, okay, but let me point out the spectacular incoherence of much of this. You know, on the one hand, you have the Deputy Prime Minister saying we should reintroduce the lifetime limit on the amount of money you can put into your pension pot, but without being taxed on it. And at the same time, these people, you know, who have £1 million in their pension pot should receive a winter fuel payment. You know, it's madness. You know, and it's as I say, it's spectacularly incoherent. You know, yes, you can tinker around with taxes on dividends and so on, but you know, the fundamental problem is that you know the economy is not growing enough. You know, all of this becomes less of a problem if you get 2.5%, let alone, you know, I mean, 3% would be wonderful, but 2.5% economic growth this year solves an awful lot of Rachel Reeves' problems, solves an awful lot of the government's problems. But at the moment, you know, doesn't look as though we're going to get that. And so everything is sort of imbued with a kind of fatalistic hopelessness at present. And I think that is one of the problems that the government faces. And it hasn't yet found a story that it wants to tell. You know, it talks about change. It talks about a decade of national renewal. But nobody is buying that at present. And there is, as I say, this sort of learned hopelessness, I think, is what one might characterize much of the last decade of British politics. And I suppose one of the things that shows that, or that has informed that has, you know, sort of dug that into the national consciousness, I think, which is that everything is broken and nothing will ever get better, is the long, tortuous history of Brexit, which has come to sort of define an era. And, you know, nobody really wants to reopen Brexit, but at the same time, this week and so on, you know, the government might say, "Look, here is an achievement. Here is something that we have achieved. We have done this. We have negotiated a new set of agreements with the European Union." Although technically, actually, it's really an agreement to agree in the future over the detail of these things on sector by sector and a whole range of issues that we can get into in a moment. So, but there's no great credit for this, and so because nobody wants to go back into the Brexit waters.
I mean, I agree with you, but we both agreed on the incoherence in terms of how the government explains its policy. And I think both you and I agree that there are actually some things which this government have done which should be commended. And it's actually just a pity that they don't have the communication skills in order to do it. So, you know, there we are. Again, and I also agree with you, incidentally, that people who have pension pots of £1 million plus shouldn't be getting winter fuel payments. But again, as I argued in the last podcast, everything has to come from first principles. So your principle is that well-off pensioners shouldn't get a winter fuel payment. Rather, you should use the money to give less well-off pensioners even more of a winter fuel payment because they need it most. It's called redistribution of resources. It's a good Labour principle. But of course, that's not what happened. You simply got this cliff edge situation where we're abolishing them overnight and we won't look at the consequences. And again, with the welfare reforms, if they would have said, we're going to have a blitz in terms of getting people from welfare into work, and as a result of doing that over the course of a parliament, we're going to save on the welfare bill, but they didn't. They simply tried to take £5 billion out of the welfare bill, and they'd already decided the conclusion rather than coming at things to the first principle. And again, it's the inability to argue things from first principles, to explain it to the country, to explain why certain things are necessary, and to go about it in an ordered way rather than a completely and utterly chaotic way. And again, if we look at sort of the broader stage, where I think Starmer does actually have a story to tell in terms of a trade deal with America, a trade deal with India, and this EU reset deal. He's also been very active in terms of trying to find a middle ground in relation to Ukraine. He has been busy, and to a certain extent, he looks more sure-footed on the international stage than he does on the domestic stage. But in the EU reset deal, of course, we had these thunderous editorials about it being a complete and utter betrayal of Brexit. And you had Farage and David Frost basically saying that this amounted to the great betrayal. And we had the utterly predictable skills of the fishing. Are fishermen ever happy?
No.
Fishermen ever happy?
Left to their own devices, they would have caught all the fish and been put themselves out of a job. Fishermen have been saved by regulation. It's one of the rare industries that requires it.
I mean, if we look at this sort of reset deal, the reduction in checks on food exports looks as if it could be quite significant. There are actually sectors indeed within sort of fishing and seafood, all of the people that are exporting Scottish salmon, they're delighted with this. They think that this is absolutely the right way to go. And when it comes to fishing, if somebody could say to me, giving boats from EU countries access to our waters is going to put all of our fishermen out of business, then I could understand in a sense where the angst may well come from. But there are 5,500 vessels in the UK who are involved in fishing. There are 10,000 people within the industry. Most of what it earns in terms of national income is absolutely and completely insignificant. Most of the fish which is consumed in this country is actually imported. And if we're looking at it in terms of gross value added to the UK economy, fishing accounts for, wait for it, don't fall off your seat, 0.02%. And yet a lot of the headlines suggesting that this was a lousy deal hung on and an industry which in economic terms, and it's big in certain parts of the country, it's totemic in the northeast of Scotland, and I get that, is not significant. And yet there are other sectors who are going to be dealing with fewer checks and less bureaucracy in terms of their exports, for whom this reset, and they're much more important to the economy, is a good deal. Now, why people can't actually welcome that is frankly beyond me.
Well, you're absolutely right. Fishing has an emotional significance that vastly outweighs its practical economic importance. And the fishermen are no worse off now than they were yesterday. This is an extension of an existing agreement on fishing, which has allowed an increase in the proportion of fish caught in UK waters to be caught by UK boats. So the fishermen are still better off than they were before Brexit, at least on their own analysis of things, of their own. And the point, I remember talking to fishermen about this and so on. They around the time of Brexit and so on, they said it's not so much what we do after Brexit, it's the ability to determine our own quotas and make our own choices. That's the importance of Brexit. Now, but it's a trade-off. The important part of this deal with the EU is is the defence arrangements. The UK having access to EU funds for rearmament. That is vastly more important on a continental-wide basis than anything to do with fishing. One of but there are ironies within this and so on. I mean, first thing to say, I think, about the Brexit reset and so on is that there is going to be a Brexit reset every couple of years for the next 20 years. That sector by sector and so on, we are going to be in constant dialogue with the European Union over market access, the regulation of industries and so on, and the political relationships between the UK, Brussels, Paris, Berlin, and so on. That is going to be an ongoing process in the same way as it is an ongoing process for Switzerland and to some extent for Norway as well. Countries that are outside the EU but have very strong economic links with the European Union, and the UK is going to fall into that category. So Brexit, in that sense, is never ever going to be done. It's never ever going to be betrayed either, because both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, quite obviously, accept the result of the referendum, and so it has to have meaning. But the great irony of this and so on is that the reset that Keir Starmer is selling now is not as good in terms of economics as the Chequers deal negotiated by Theresa May all those years ago, which Keir Starmer voted against because, of course, at that time, there was the lunacy, in my view, of diehard Remainers voting against the best available deal on the basis that Brexit could be reversed. It could be unwound. The referendum could be cancelled. And so as a result of that, you had an awful lot of people who ended up voting in ways that made a harder, harsher, sharper, fuller, deeper Brexit more likely, indeed more necessary, perhaps, because they wouldn't take the half cake they were offered by Theresa May.
Yeah, and
that includes the SNP as well. They've also voted against it.
Yes, I mean, we've been talking quite a lot in recent podcasts about the inability of the UK Labour government to get his message out coherently. I saw 3 interviews from 3 different SNP politicians on this reset deal, one which was quite positive, one which was scathingly against, and one which was sort of in the middle. And I thought they don't seem to have worked out their line on this. And of course, I mean, the ultimate irony in all of this is that when SNP figures were saying that this was a betrayal of the Scottish fishing industry, about these boats fishing in Scottish territorial waters, and yet the party that wants to go back into the EU, and this is something I support, is the SNP. So the SNP were denouncing something that they would need to accept if an independent Scotland got back into the EU.
Now, Bernard, you misunderstand things and so on. I think you would find that in the negotiations between a putatively independent Scotland and Brussels, Edinburgh would hold all the cards because it is currently SNP policy, and people within the SNP are welcome to get in touch and tell me if I'm wrong about this, but it is currently SNP policy to rejoin the EU, but with an opt-out from the common fisheries policy. And it is presumed that Brussels will just say, yeah, that's absolutely fine and dandy with us.
Well, you're not getting in.
Nevertheless, that is SNP policy as articulated by successive First Ministers.
I am afraid that if you're a membership of a club, you have to sign up to the basic principles of the club. And of course, one of the basic principles of the club is that they would have access to fishing waters. The idea that you can accept 9 out of the 10 rules, and the 10 rules are all underpinned by a common approach to certain things, including single markets and all the rest of it, that you uniquely, as part of a club of what it would be 28 countries, would have your own opt-out, is for the fairies.
Well, the SNP, believe in a lot of fairies.
Yes, and clear. Well, it ain't happening. It ain't happening. But we've also had, this idea also from this deal of young people work and travel. I think the Erasmus program,
Yeah.
there's stuff on that as well, which again, I specifically heard SNP people welcome during the week. There may well be a cap on this, but young people working, traveling in Europe, new experiences, broadening their horizons, improving their qualifications, uh,
Mhm.
getting themselves more skills which make them more economically beneficial to the country can only be a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the SNP line on this ought to be, well, we welcome these modest improvements and so on, but we believe that the government should have fought harder and got more and taken on the sort of Brexit media and the Conservative Party and Reform and had the courage of standing by its principles, etc., etc., etc. And there is much more work that needs to be done on this. So while welcome, it's merely a set of baby steps and so on. Well, we need a much bolder, more imaginative path and a sort of re-engagement with Europe, etc., etc., etc. That it seems to be would be the line from the SNP that is at least vaguely honest as well, and accepts that there are trade-offs and so on. So if you want, greater access for agricultural goods and so on, the part of the trade-off for that is a deal on fishing, which you may not like all the every aspect of, but of course that kind of grown-up conversation and so on is very difficult in the current political culture, which is one which seeks to deny the reality, the unavoidable reality of trade-offs.
Yeah, and Mr. Starmer has done his bit for the Brexiteer voting community in Britain, because for all of you folk that like to go on holiday with your Union Jack boxer shorts, waving your flag when you go on holiday.
That's a lot
uh,
of our listeners, I'm sure.
yeah, I'm sure, but for those of you who are lovers of Brexit but who like to go abroad and who like to wear your Union Jack boxer shorts, you're going to get through the e-gates a bit more quickly as a result of this.
Yeah, well, I mean that's actually quite a significant thing. If this happens and so on, and UK citizens don't have to spend as long queuing to get through, passport control and so on. For a lot of people, that actually is the main impact of Brexit on their day-to-day lives. That's where they feel it, and so resolving that actually will make a meaningful difference to quite a lot of people. It sounds like a small thing, but it is for a lot of people. It's much larger than you might think.
And of course, the referendum, as some people have argued, was not a referendum on the institutions of the EU or the record of the EU over a long number of years. Of course, we joined on the 1st of January 1973 when it was called the European Economic Community. The six became nine. And of course, the nine expanded over the years, and there were various treaties and so on. But were the benefits of EU membership, and indeed the downside in governance terms of EU membership, were they debated in that referendum? Not really. It was all about emotion. And as some people have said, it was all really about a referendum on migration, on immigration. And hot off the presses this morning, the net migration figures for 2024 were released, 431,000, and that is down 50% in 2023. How Rishi Sunak must have hoped that the 2023 figures were 50% down on the 2022 figures, 431,000. So, in that sense, they're going from those who want to cut these aggressively, they're going in the right direction. But the reason that the numbers have fallen is due to a significant fall in the number of student numbers. And it begs a question, and I've argued this a number of times on the podcast. If we take the student numbers out, because these students who come here, who are contributing, who are paying, who are increasingly propping up the university sector, who are spending money here, and who don't have an automatic pathway at a permanent residency unless they start earning a certain number of money and unless they're paying taxes and unless they're in a good job. Given that they're not necessarily going to be permanently resident, take them out the figures because they're not permanent. Do that, and a lot of the heat on this debate, I would say, would dissipate.
Absolutely. I suppose the context for 450,000 is still significantly more than from the period sort of 2006 to 2016. It tended, net migration tended to run at around 250,000 people a year. So adding a city the size of Aberdeen each year. Last year it's a city nearly as big as Edinburgh, but the type of migration matters. Again, you go back to when Theresa May was prime minister and so on. She said, we've got to crack down on immigration and so on. But when pollsters ask people, do you think students from overseas should be counted in the net migration figures? The majority of people said no. So this was an easy political and policy win for successive governments, and they have refused to take the win that was offered to them. It's baffling. But then politicians often take baffling decisions and end up in baffling places that are contrary, run counter to their own professed ambitions. There is a painful irony in some ways. There was a great story that could be told about how immigration, yes, it can place a certain amount of stress on access to GPs, housing in certain parts of the country, etc., etc., etc. But overall, net migration of this sort is a vote of confidence in the United Kingdom. It shows that Britain is succeeding because however difficult migration might be in terms of welcoming and assimilating new people into this country, the problems it poses are vastly smaller than the problems posed by the alternative, which is emigration and a falling population. And that brings with it a whole host of problems that are much, much more difficult.
And once again, comrade, we have consensus in Edom on this particular point. We should probably try and choose one or two issues for the podcast where we actually violently disagree.
well, I'm sure you could come up with some there, Bernard, where you've got some sort of appalling neo-Trotskyite leanings.
No, I was never a fan of Trotsky. No, Trotsky. I wasn't Leon's guy. No, not at all. If you're suggesting that I may well hing a wee bit more to the left than your good self, that's probably true. But there we shall leave it for today. We've had a good old kick at the ball from the Hamilton Larkhall Stonehouse by-election to winter fuel payments, as Rayner's tax proposals, EU reset deal, and the net migration figures this morning. We'll be back in the next week with another podcast, but for the moment, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.